Greetings, friends. This is Jesse here, and we're going to continue our reading with The Grand Design Exposed by John Daniel. And before we get into Chapter 2, Section 3, we're going to back up a couple of paragraphs because we were introduced to some very interesting characters and some interesting players that leads up to the betrayal of the Templar Knights. And one of them was Pope Clement V, and the other one, Pope Clement V, Jacques de Molay, and the King of France, Philip IV. And Philip IV plays a very unique role in opposition to the papacy, or is that what is being portrayed as opposition to the papacy? Okay, so just pay real close attention to this next section because this gets really interesting in this little piece of history. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're going to back up a couple of paragraphs here. In 1291, Roman Catholics forced from the Holy Land was complete, never to be restored. The Knights Templar retreated to the island of Cyprus as a temporary place of residence. Here they dreamed and planned for another crusade, but Europe no longer rallied to the cry for a holy war. The fervor was gone. So much wealth had been spent and so many lives lost in vain that it became a dead issue. In effect, the Templars had lost their purpose to exist. What was worse, they had made many enemies because of their arrogance and haughty ways. They were also in constant conflict with the Hospitallers. Some even suggested including the Pope. For practical purposes, the two orders of knights should be combined. And with this in mind, Pope Clement V summoned Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, to appear before him. The King of France, Philip IV, the most powerful monarch on the continent at the time, also looked favorably on the merger proposals, but with a totally different point of view. So here was Philip IV coming along. He agreed with the proposal of Pope Clement V, but he wanted to add his own little twist to it. Let's see what that twist was. And in the next section, it's going to really get into it. He had Pope King Philip IV, King of France. He had proposed to Pope Clement V that the kings of France be named the hereditary Grand Masters of the combined orders, and that he himself be appointed as supreme commander to be known as War King. The only one who seemed to like his idea was Philip himself. So here we have the battle of two wicked people, the Pope and King Philip IV. And so this was a little struggle here between the King of France and the papacy and the Knights Templar, resulting in the betrayal of the Knights Templar and these types of things, as we are going to see in the betrayal. So, as an alternative to gain access to the Templars' wealth, Philip developed a plan to bring the Templar order down. And now we move on to section 3, which is entitled Templars Betrayed. By 1306, the Templars had become the focus of particular attention for Philip IV of France. Philip was enormously ambitious. He had grandiose designs for his country and gave little thought about crushing whoever or whatever stood in his way. he had already engineered the kidnapping and murder of one pope, Boniface VIII, and is widely believed to have orchestrated the death, probably by poison, of another, which was Benedict XI, who followed. By 1305, he had installed his own puppet on the papal throne, which was Clement V. In 1309, Philip hijacked the papacy itself, uprooting it from Rome and relocated it on French soil at Avignon, where it remained, dividing the Catholic Church for the next 68 years. With the papacy thus in his pocket, Philip had the latitude he needed to move against the Templars, and with staggering swiftness and efficient precision he did. So, even though the papacy was a very powerful institution, as what Scripture states, they had their quarrels with other nations. Okay, because see here, Philip IV seemed to have a one-upmanship with the papacy, installing his own pope on the papal throne, moving the papacy to France. Okay. It was very short-lived, 68 years. I mean, it seems like a long time, but this is a very unique little point in history. With the papacy thus in his pocket, Philip had the latitude he needed to move against the Templars, and with staggering swiftness and efficient precision, he did. With sealed orders kept absolutely secret and not to be opened until the given time, in one stroke, every Knight Templar found in France, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were arrested, placed in chains, and cast in prison. Trumped-up charges of the most sinister kinds of heresy were brought to bear and broadcasted effectively throughout the realm. Immediately, the inquisitors went to their hideous work, torturing their victims, extorting those confessions they wanted to hear. The shrieks rending the air of those tortured terrified those who knew they were next. Within a few days after the tortures began, 36 Templars died as a result. Some had their feet burned totally off, and understandably a number are reported to have gone mad from the pain. One Templar was helped to a council of inquiry later, carrying with him the blackened bones that had dropped out of his feet as they were burned off. He had been permitted by his torturers to keep the bones as sickening souvenirs. Pope Clement V refused to believe the accusations Philip was bringing against the Templars. But, with some bullying, relentless pressure, and intimidation, the weak Pope finally caved in, reluctantly cooperating with the king. So here's one of not too many instances where, the papacy was a weak vessel compared to the king. Usually it's the other way around. But Philip IV, King of France, they were they were a big time headache to the church at this time. Okay, and the Knights Templar, and not saying that they were some great thing, they were caught in the middle here, which led ultimately to their betrayal. It was true the Templars had made some enemies, but it was also true and very obvious that the other nations in Europe did not believe the charges either. So again, here you have this protest of some of these Templars and these types of things that's going to come through, as you're going to see later on in this chapter. Most nations acquitted them outright, saying they were innocent. Some allowed them to go into other orders or changes into secular clothes, shave their beard, and melt into the crowd. In Portugal, they found refuge by just changing their name to Knights of Christ. Christopher Columbus was a Templar Knight of Christ. England and Ireland dragged their feet. Scotland ignored the Pope's excommunication altogether and became a haven for the fugitives. In France, a terror went on. Torture, excommunications, and for relapsed heretics, they were burned alive in public wholesale executions. 4.5 years after the first arrest, Pope Clement V on March 1312 declared the Knights Templar disbanded, yet without proclaiming them either guilty or innocent. All Templar property, except in Spain and Portugal, was to be transferred to the Hospitallers. 2 years after that, March 1314, the Grand Master Jacques de Molay was roasted alive over a slow fire. The order that began in such glory now ended in public disgrace. The decree from the Pope was infallible. So again, even though you had this schism, you had this conflict between the King of France and the Pope, still the decrees that came from the Pope's chair, from ex cathedra, was infallible. It was infallibility. What he says goes, even though he just couldn't seem to persuade the king. So it's like you had bad guy versus bad guy. Okay. Any Templar not brought to justice was a fugitive from law and subject to arrest. Yet everyone knew the whole affair was disturbingly wrong. It became a church scandal that needed to be hushed, covered up, but certainly the cover-up business was nothing new to Rome. The church's suppression of its repulsive involvement, especially when it advertises it can do no wrong, was to save face. The running Templars' silence was to keep from being caught. What seems to us today as a minor, generally obscure fragment of medieval history is just a point that should be made here. It has been purposely made obscure. How many today have even heard of the Knights Templar? But you can be assured of this, when it was all happening, it was the most dominant issue of its time, dramatically surpassing events in faraway Scotland, galvanizing opinions and reactions across the Catholic world, sending tremors throughout all Western culture. The Templar, it must be remembered, was, with the sole exception of the papacy itself, the most important, most powerful, most prestigious, most apparently unshakable institution of its age. It was regarded as one of the central pillars of Western Catholicism. For most of its contemporaries, it seemed as immutable, as durable, as permanent as the Church herself. That such an edifice should be so suddenly demolished rocked the very foundation upon which rested the assumption and beliefs of that time. Indeed, for an example of the indelible impression this tragedy made upon minds is found in the superstition which holds Friday the 13th to be a day of misfortune. Most today having not the vaguest idea of its origin, will find that it grew from the very date when King Philip made his initial arrest, on Friday the 13th, October, 1307. So here, all of a sudden, a very large and prestigious group of men of Europe, the rejected military monk, found himself in a weird and totally new condition. The Pope had rejected him, so he had no choice but to reject the Pope. Before, during his entire life in the Templar order, his link with God had been through his Grand Master, who was responsible only to the Pope, who claimed to be God's sole viceroy on earth. Now his religious order had been dissolved, his Grand Master had been burnt at the stake, and Christ's vicar had cast him aside. He still believed in God, but his chain of intercession with God had been stripped away. Now, for the first time in his life, no one stood between God and himself. His prayers of solicitation and thanksgiving, his acts of adoration, his hopes of salvation could no longer be through the Pope, and were now on a purely personal basis, not by choice, but brutally thrust upon him. To the medieval mind, there could have been no other harrowing and traumatic experience imaginable. It was from this most brutal and overwhelming experience that the seeds of Protestantism were violently sown, left to germinate fully 60 years and more before John Wycliffe and the Lollards came on the scene. Those seeds were free to germinate and propagate because they were nurtured in complete secrecy, and they gave strength to others who were also religiously persecuted and disillusioned. And that's going to conclude this section, which is called Templars Betrayed. This was section 3 out of chapter 2. So again, I mean, you had a lot going on in this section. You had King Philip IV, who agreed upon merging the two groups, these two societies together. But King Philip IV wanted to do it his way, and really the only groups or people that agreed to it was only one person, and that was King Philip IV himself. So that created a little bit of a tension struggle between the papacy and the King of France. And finally the papacy, caved in a sense, in that they ended up disbanding the Knights Templar because the Knights Templar wouldn't go along with this merging. And all of Europe were basically protesting that these people were innocent. And in the midst of them being tortured and persecuted, and I mean, you just read about how they were tortured and persecuted. Some of them were able to escape, go underground, change their appearance, change their name from Knights of Templar to Knights of Christ, in which Christopher Columbus is one of those. Still dominantly Roman Catholic, mind you. But a lot of them basically blended in with the crowd. They became like regular people, still holding on to their spirituality, I guess you could say, and their occultic mindsets, but they basically blended in with the crowd. And this was basically the whole aspect of the betrayal of the Knights Templar. Now, in the next section, we're going to read how these fugitives, these Knights Templars who are now basically fugitives on the run, blending in with the people, received friendly help. And that's going to be the title of the next section when we get into the next section. So, and then I believe, so that'll be section 4, and then we have section 5, and then that will be the end of the chapter. So we should be in chapter 3, hopefully no later by Thursday. And so the interesting history is only going to pick up from there. So again, I want to thank you for listening. Truth be told, truth be known, stay safe, God bless, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.